Probably all seen that it's, you probably celebrated the idea that it's now the season of brotherly shove. If you made it to the mall and any of you that went shopping, kind of complicated. I actually posted on our Facebook page this kind of crazy video, and I won't mention the student's name, but I'm talking to one of our young people about, on Christmas morning, did they ever get a present that they weren't expecting? In other words, they saw the package, it was under the tree, and they thought for sure it was going to be this certain thing. And actually the video I posted with this young boy, probably about 3, 4 years old, and he sees the packages, and he opens it, and it's actually books. And he's like, books? Books? Are you kidding me? On Christmas? I wanted a toy. And how many of us in our journey through Christmas, we're looking for that toy, and the package that comes to us isn't, you look at it and you wonder what's in the box, and you wonder if it's that thing that you've asked for, that shirt or the new technology. But it's interesting how, and in fact, you Google on YouTube, you can find all sorts of fun videos that way of where what they expected the gift wasn't the reality when they opened the package. Seriously, have any of you been that place on Christmas morning where what you gave to the child wasn't exactly what the child expected? And, even as adults, we get disappointed by the presents that come our way in life. For instance, if you're married, maybe you told your husband about boots that you wanted, those sort of classy looking boots, and you told him the right boot, the exact model and size and style, and and you get the box, and you open the box on Christmas morning, and it's like Nutrisystem or something from Weight Watchers, which is like, that's not going to go very far. You wanted a toy, but it is not what you wanted. Or, ladies, your husband wants that new iPhone, the iPhone 6, and so he gets the package, and it's the right size, and it's the right weight, and then he opens it up, and it's like nose hair clippers. It's like complete disappointment. So again, it's not what you want. Sometimes you get what you need, not what you want. And so this morning, as we begin this amazing time of Advent, if you would, in your worship program, if you pull out the notes, I'd like us to read together, actually out of the book of Romans. There on your handout, if you could read together Romans 15:13. I pray that God, who gives you hope, will keep you happy and full of peace as you believe in Him. May you overflow with hope to the power of the Holy Spirit. And I want you to notice there that last phrase, may you overflow with hope to the power of the Holy Spirit. And if we think about the world around us, and thinking even this morning, wondering the young football player who's still missing from Ohio State, who, for whatever reason, and the mother that received a text from him saying that he's sorry for being a burden, and we don't know what that means, but so the joy of actually missing that game yesterday that he had trained so many evenings and afternoons for. And in fact, for some people, Christmas 2014 is going to be complicated, and in fact, some people are going to be very glad to see 2014 come to an end, because this year didn't turn out like they had hoped. Again, you wanted the toy, and it didn't turn out that way. Some of you may know a college student who maybe just recently graduated, who's trying to find a job. Maybe it's your grandchild. And maybe they've had to move back home with their parents. Again, it's not joy, it's not the toy, if you will, that they wanted. Life has not turned out the way they had hoped it would. Or maybe some of you are hoping this Christmas would be the first time that you could celebrate being a grandparent, or maybe even being a parent, or your children were there expecting, maybe because of miscarriage or infertility, or maybe an adoption that fell through. Or maybe for some of you, there's an empty chair at your Christmas table this year. Maybe you've had to allow a loved one to pass on, and you miss them. And so some of you may know someone even who got maybe married recently, maybe in the last couple of years, and how they were this Disney junkie, and they thought the marriage was going to be all this and more, and now that they've leaned into it, they find out that it's very complicated. And the truth is, there's disillusionment and there's disappointment. And so this time of the year even can bring about, as we just celebrated Thanksgiving, a pretty tense time, because it means dealing with relatives that maybe there's some unresolved issues with. Or maybe it's dealing with ex-spouses or your children's ex-spouses and custody issues with their children, and then the issue of grandkids and just all the messiness of that. Or maybe you're going to walk out of here today alone. You're going to see others walking out with their partners, and maybe somebody even holding hands, and that memory is going to be something that's going to hurt because you're all alone. Yes, again, I wanted a toy, but it didn't turn out that way. So what I want to do this morning is I want us to look at a book in the Bible that I don't think you would expect a Christmas story to come from. It's in the Old Testament, and it's actually the 8th book of the Bible. It's the book of Ruth. And I want us to look at Ruth because there's an interesting story there that everything that we're celebrating this morning hangs on. I don't know that maybe you've seen that. So let me set that up. The book of Ruth is it's only 4 chapters. We could actually read it this morning. I mean, it's only about 11 minutes if you read it from chapter 1 through to the end. And it's an interesting story. I mean, it's the judges are ruling in Israel. This is before the time of the kings. There's a famine in the land, and we don't know what the famine is all about, whether it's the judgment of God or something's going on. But as we turn to Ruth chapter 1, we begin understanding some history. And so the writer says, there was a man named Elimelech who decided to move his family away from the promised land, away from the land of Canaan during this time of famine, to the land of Moab, which was a foreign land. And Elimelech's name actually means, my God is king. But the problem is he didn't live up to his name. Instead of trusting the one living God to supply his food for his family, he actually moved to Moab, this foreign land, and he trusted the foreign gods there. Now, his wife, her name is Naomi, and it's interesting, again, her name means pleasant and sweet. And they have 2 sons, but this is bizarre. I mean, I love the Old Testament because their sons' names are Mahlon and Chilion, which in Hebrew, literally, the first son's name is sick, and the second son's name is dying. Now think about that. Why would you name your children sick and dying? I mean, that'd be like, naming a child bird flu and walking pneumonia. I mean, in today's context, it's like, why would you do that? So don't pass those names off to your grandchildren, or your children to give to your grandchildren, because they don't know exactly we want to have to celebrate that. So as the story unfolds, there's these 2 boys who grow up, and they fall in love with 2 Moabite women. And this is, again, we're in a foreign land, and it's a pagan culture. And they're not believers in Yahweh, the God of the Old Testament. And by the time we get to the end of the 2nd paragraph of Ruth 1, tragedy strikes the family. Naomi's husband, Elimelech, dies. Now, we don't know how he dies. The scriptures aren't going to know if it was old age, heart attack, or he got hit by a camel. I mean, who knows what was going on. And then, unbelievably, a short time later in the book, just a few sentences later, both of her sons die. So, yeah, get this, sick and dying and die. I mean, shock there, right? So now you've got 3 widows. You've got Naomi, her 2 daughters-in-law, all sharing in the Kleenex box, and they're all grieving the loss of their husbands. Can you imagine grieving not only the loss of your husband, but also both of your adult-aged sons about the same time? So all 3 of these women are battling what some of us will battle this holiday season, and that's this issue of loneliness. And so what Naomi decides to do is she decides the best thing. She decides to move back to her homeland, to Canaan, to what we know as the Promised Land. Now she's a foreigner, and there's no welfare system in Moab, and there's no church to take care of her. There was no help. Her daughters-in-law, who were also battling loneliness, were so attached to her that they decided they were going to move back with her. And they're going to leave their land, Moab, and go back to the Promised Land with Naomi. And about halfway down the road, Naomi tried to turn them around, and she says, girls, you don't need the baggage of a mother-in-law hanging on to you. You need a man, so go back home and find another man. And one of them, whose name is Orpah, excuse me, took her up on the offer. So Orpah turns around and goes back. But the other daughter-in-law, Ruth, insisted on going with Naomi. And if you look at your handout here, this is probably a verse you've heard before, Ruth chapter 1, verse 16. Naomi, where you go, I will go, she says. And where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if ever even death separates you and me. Now, that where you go, I will go, we've all heard that. That's always in a wedding ceremony, but if you look at the context here, it's kind of interesting because actually the context is, it's really, to practice it correctly, it means that during the wedding ceremony, the bride looked to her mother-in-law and says to her mother-in-law, where you go, I will go. Now, I'm going to guess that that's not a tradition that's going to catch on, right? Right? It's probably not. So Ruth and Naomi take this adventuresome trip to Naomi's hometown. And now this is the cool part. This is where it ties into, the book of Ruth ties into our story here this morning as we celebrate the first Sunday of Advent. Because her hometown is Bethlehem. Okay? So the first clue as to why this story is important to the Christmas story is, what's the song we sing? The little town of Bethlehem. You know how many people were probably around the town of Bethlehem at that time? Probably about 200 people. So I'm not sure whether it's Waldo or Jeromesville or what little burg it is, but it's not, when we think of these cities sometimes, I don't think we realize that it's not a very large city. And so the idea of 200 people living in Bethlehem. So when Naomi returns, it's big news. The people started to talk. They're saying, is that her? Is that Naomi? Is she back in town? Now, I want you to remember something, that her name means pleasant or sweet. And so Naomi says to them, and it's there at the bottom of the first page of your handout, she says, verse 20, don't call me Naomi anymore. Don't call me pleasant, don't call me sweet. You need to call me Mara. And because the Almighty has made my life very bitter. And I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me pleasant and sweet? The Lord has afflicted me. The Almighty has brought misfortune upon me. So I want you to see Ruth's expression here this morning. I want you to see that she's angry, that she's mad at God, that he's not held up his end of the deal. You remember, I want a toy? I wanted a toy, but I didn't get it. I wanted this certain package, and you've not brought it. Thank God what you brought is you've brought misery upon my life. So I want us to think about Naomi's story. It's really a story, some would say it's a story about loss. She's lost her husband, she's lost her sons, she's lost her home, she's lost her land, and it's a story about loss. So we think, but here's what I want to ask you today. Does it have to be about loss? Does her story have to be about that which she's lost? Or is there something there that we can sort of dive deeper in? Because yeah, she's lived a lot of incredible pain, more pain than maybe one person should. But sometimes our pain matters. You remember the first Sunday I was here, I brought out my bike. And one of the folks that I met riding my bike is a gentleman by the name of Rich Dixon. And Rich was a teacher in Colorado. And if I show you the picture, you would see Rich, actually, he's a paraplegic today. Because in 1987, he fell from a roof while he was putting up his Christmas lights over Thanksgiving break. And he damaged his spinal cord to the point where he's now in a wheelchair ever since. Now, Rich actually has written a couple books, and in his one book called Relentless Grace, he challenges the idea, and he had to process this because in his own story, he was like Ruth. He was angry because of what life had thrown at him. But through a series of serendipities now, as God has revealed himself to he through his wife Becky, Rich is at a whole different place, to the point where he just recently competed in, there's a famous bike race in Tucson, Arizona that he participated in. Now, this is a gentleman who has to be helped by his bride into a bicycle, in which I helped him do this when we did the Cincinnati trip, where they Velcro his feet to the front of the bike. And they actually Velcro his hands because his fingers really don't work well to the pedal. It sort of is in front of him and cranks like this. That gentleman has done amazing trips. He and his wife 3 years ago actually did the entire length of the Mississippi River, starting at the Canadian border all the way down to New Orleans. Just two Mays ago, he and his bride actually did the entire perimeter of Florida, which is just like crazy. But part of the reason that Rich is doing that is he's trying to help people see that sometimes the greater the obstacles, the sweeter the success. And so as we look at Ruth's story this morning, we need to realize there's something deeper going on here, something that we need to hang on to, and how, as we read the Old Testament, here it is, we're not even halfway into it, not even a third of the way, not even a quarter of the way into God's great storybook, and immediately God's reminding us of his desire to offer us, as we celebrate this morning, hope and promise. You remember even 5 or 6 weeks ago, as we talked about planning for the future, that I talked about how our past is prologue to the future. That all that we've experienced, individually and corporately as a church, the messiness of that, and that's all part of what God is writing for us today as we move into this Christmas time. And so that's why it's really important that you grab one of these cards and reach out to a coworker or to a family friend and invite them to come and hear these next 3 Sundays about the gift that God's offering them. And then to come and invite them to come back on Christmas Eve when we really put on the Ritz and really show the story that we're invited to be a part of. So here's what I want to say. Sometimes we don't get to decide the roles we play in life, but we can decide how we play the roles that we're given. And so you reach this point when you're dealing with loss, you reach this point in your story, in your journey, in your adventure, as one of the students said this morning, where you have to decide, is your story going to be defined by the loss, or could your story be about something else? It could be something different. And I know that's hard, but that's why community is so important. We tend to get focused on what's right in front of us, and sometimes we need the context of community to help us figure out what this thing is in the box. Because we want what's in the box. We want to open it up, and when we open it up, we don't want to be disappointed when it's like the sweater instead of the toy, or it's not what we hoped for. But this is where we're going to see in the story. If there's one word to describe Naomi's life, and I'd love you some room here to fill this in, her life is not about loss. It's about redemption. It's about what God's going to do. So let's plow back into the story. Once Ruth and Naomi arrived to this adventure to Bethlehem, Ruth goes into the fields and she begins picking up grain left behind by the farmer left there. It was the barley harvest season. You say, why did she do that? Because she had work to do. There was nobody else to support them. There was no welfare system. In fact, the welfare system of Israel on that day, there was a law that required, and you may know about this, the idea of gleaning. That actually they were required not to harvest all the field. In fact, if you read the full story, it's really interesting how Boaz sort of set some things up for her to actually be able to provide for her and her mother-in-law. So Ruth starts picking up the leftover grain, and it's not a glamorous job. It'd be like somebody who walks along picking up aluminum cans across the highway here today for a living. But you have to respect that she's trying to start somewhere. So it's here that Ruth gets noticed by the last main character in the story. He's a wealthy single dude who had never been married, whose name was Boaz. And he's the owner of the field, and he actually takes notice of her. And here on the backside of your worship notes is Ruth chapter 2, verse 3. So she went out and began to glean behind the harvesters, and as it turned out, she found herself working in a field belonging to Boaz, who was from the clan of Elimelech. Now I want you to circle that word as it turned out. I mean, are you kidding me? In all of this area of Bethlehem, she just happens to go to a field. It happens to be owned, just as it turns out, happens to be owned by somebody that's actually part of her family. That is really crazy. Wouldn't you know it, coincidentally? As good Presbyterians, we sort of don't believe in that, do we? We believe that God is working in the details. So she happens to end up on the field of Boaz, and this wealthy, single, godly guy who has never been married, who, unbeknown to Ruth, is a relative of her late husband. So the long story short on Boaz is that he notices Ruth. It's like, whoa, who is she? He likes her. In fact, he actually, if you read the story, and I would encourage you to do that, he befriends her. And when Naomi finds out what's going on, she decides to play Cupid, and she says to Ruth, and I love this thing, these words are great, here's what I want you to do tonight. I want you to bathe, and I want you to put on your best perfume, and I want you to put on your prettiest clothes. I mean, this is great advice from a mother-in-law, right? And after he's done eating, talking about Boaz, I want you to go to where he's working, and he's going to lie down in the barn, and he's going to go to sleep. And when he does, you go and lie down at his feet, and he will tell you what to do from there. Now, for some of us, we're thinking this is a hookup, right? But it's not what you think. It's the furthest thing. In fact, in their culture, what she's basically doing is she's preparing herself to say to Boaz, I'm available, and I'm willing to move where you want me to move. I'm willing to be a very liberated woman and follow you, if you will. So now, listen to what happens next. Now, I actually use this as a paraphrase from the Living Bible, just because I like the way it read. In Ruth 3, it says that suddenly, around midnight, Boaz awakened, sat up startled, and there was this woman lying at his feet. Who are you? He demanded. Now, mind you, it's dark, and he's just waking up, wiping sleep out of his eyes. He can't see. And And she says, "It is I, sir." "Ruth," she replied, "make me your wife according to God's law, for you are my close relative." And then he says, "Thank God for a girl like you." "I guess so, right? So don't worry about this thing, child." He says, "I'll handle all the details, for everyone knows what a wonderful person you are." Now, is that a cool story? I mean, I just think this is just full of greatness. And so I think it's such a practical story, and especially as we think about Christmas and what that means for us. Now, I'll take you through a little Old Testament theology here. Boaz is what we call, is being called actually throughout the whole book of Ruth. He's called a guardian redeemer. A guardian redeemer. And what that basically means is that you may actually see it listed as being a kinsman redeemer. And so what the guardian redeemer law basically says is this, is when a man fell into hard times and was forced to sell his land, his nearest relative, what was called the guardian redeemer, could buy the land. They could step in and purchase the land and keep the relative's property from coming under the ownership of somebody else. Because in the Old Testament times, the land is the important part of their story. And I know that seems weird, but how is it that it's set up in that day so the property wouldn't be lost to another tribe? So it's all about the family. So Boaz comes along and says, "I will take the property of Elimelech, and I will take the responsibility for Ruth," because he also had to take responsibility for the family members at that time. And this is where the story gets sort of interesting. So it's no small act of kindness and sacrifice here, because when you consider that Ruth is a Moabite, she's a foreigner, and she's from a pagan culture, there's a lot of strange things that he's got to be careful about. But Boaz says, "I will love who no one else can love. I will care for who no one else will care for, and I will redeem who no one else will redeem. I will be the guardian redeemer." So Boaz falls for Ruth. He makes his plan to redeem Ruth. And actually, the story takes an interesting turn here, because there's actually a relative that's closer to her than Boaz would be. And so he has the right of first refusal. So I love what happens here. So Boaz goes to the guy who has the right of first refusal, and he's thinking, how can he play this, because he really likes Ruth. He says, "There's this land you can redeem." He says to the other relative, "If you want to," now, by the way, I just want to remind you that not only do you get the land, but you know that woman from the foreign culture, Ruth, well, you know, she's a pagan, she's a dead man's widow. In order to maintain the deed, you get her too. So you see, he sort of sets up so what ends up happening. Isn't that great? It's like going to buy a house, and you wonder why it's so cheap, and then you find out that there's actually, the realtor tells you, "Well, by the way, there's a mother-in-law that lives upstairs, and she's not leaving." Okay? So, in fact, the realtor says, "I know you're going to enjoy her. I'll bet you will." So at this point, the first right of refusal is exercised, and the guy says, "I don't want that, so you can have her." So in the last chapter of the book of Ruth, we read there, verse 4:13, chapter 4, verse 13. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. And this is interesting. "And when he made love to her, the Lord enabled her to conceive, and she gave birth to a son." Now, that is a cool story. But the story doesn't end there. See, this is just an amazing man, Boaz, and he has no legal obligation to do this. It's just pure grace that he's offering. And so what did Boaz get in the deal? He gets an awesome wife. Let's see if this works. And what was Boaz's life before this moment? Ready for this? He was ruthless. Okay? Sorry. That's as good. So Boaz comes along and he says, "I will buy the property, I will take responsibility," and he goes out of his way to redeem this foreign woman. And as it turns out, I want to suggest that some of you may even know who Boaz's mother is. Does anybody know? This is where the story gets really interesting. Do you remember a few weeks ago we talked about the Israelites and the spies going into Jericho? Do you remember who they stayed with? Does anybody know? Rahab. Rahab the prostitute is Boaz's father. Mother, yes, right. Rahab, so it turns out Rahab has a son. Okay. As it turns out, Rahab, the streetwalker, named her son Boaz. As it turned out, he actually grew to be a godly man. Now, this is really, really important for us today, because his own mother had been from a foreign land and a foreign culture, and she changed from following pagan gods to the one true God of Israel. And Boaz then was able to show comfort and grace and protection and generosity to Ruth. Now, you think about this story, and it's like a Christmas present that was open and looked like really dumb on the outside of the box. Everything's bad for Ruth and Naomi, but then over time, as they get down inside the box, it was better than they could have ever imagined. So what I'm saying to you today is, you may think of Christmas, and you know, the problem is when we open the package and we begin to start going through it, and we pull off all the ribbon, and we pull off the packaging, and what we find sometimes is this idea that, you know, and you just look, I mean, I just had some words here, but there's addiction, abuse, there's death, there's adultery, there's pain, there's infertility, there's loneliness, there's loss, there's unemployment, there's cancer, there's divorce. I mean, it's a mess. Our lives are a mess sometimes. And it isn't until we open the package that we begin to see what the great story is. And we realize that in the story from Ruth, that Ruth had a grandson. Okay? And that grandson brought hope. You following me? You tracking with me? I mean, this is the story out of the scriptures. And out of the grandson and hope comes a future for each of us. And then out of that future comes blessing. And what I want you to see is salvation. Because if you turn to Matthew chapter 1, what you find in Matthew chapter 1 is the story of the genealogy of Jesus. And so what we think is a mess turns out to be this incredible story that God has promised us. Because if you read there the last scripture under the handout, and they named him Obed, that's who the grandson's name is, and his father was Jesse, who was the father of David. And what does that mean for us as Christians? It means that in the lineage of Jesus is the father of David. So Jesus is actually tied to the story of Ruth. And if we don't have Ruth in the 8th book of the Bible, then all that we're expecting today in terms of hope isn't realized. So it all comes together in this beautiful story in Matthew chapter 1, where the Christmas story begins. And see, for Matthew, as a tax collector, he was into the details. And he wanted us to see, even as we look backwards, that it all comes together. So, years later in the city of Bethlehem, why did Joseph and Mary have to go to Bethlehem? Because it was Ruth's city. You see that? How cool is this? Because they were from his lineage. They had to go back where their lineage began to register for the census, as we always read on Christmas Eve, the Luke chapter 2 story. They went out on their way because there had been a census call. So way down inside the box is Jesus. That's an awesome story. So if you're thinking with me this morning and you've unwrapped the box and you don't like what it says on the outside from your perspective, right now maybe you can't even see something that is positive. Here's what I want you to know. I don't want you to give up. Because I know it's hard not to give up. I know some of you feel like you've been prayed out all day, and before you give up, I want you to remember that God has a story, and that loss doesn't have to define our story. And our response to loss, like my friend Rich, is all about tact. A lot of you don't think you can get through Christmas because there's just this messiness that's coming at you. You wanted a toy. A lot of you don't think you can make it through the Christmas season because you don't like what's on the outside of the box, because it's messy. But here's what you need to understand. Through Jesus Christ, through Jesus, your guardian redeemer, you can. Because Jesus brings us, as we've celebrated this morning, hope. He's the promise. That's why he came. And he's the one who knows the loss, and he doesn't have to be your story. Now the question is, how do you respond to it? As one who is lost, when Jesus said, "Come to me, all of you who are weary and burdened, and I can give you rest," he meant it. And he's the one that can bring you that to you this Christmas. Because see, as we're going to celebrate here in just a moment, there was a bloodstained cross that on the outside looked like it was the end of the story, and it was a really bad story. But when you look deep inside the box, like the tomb, it's empty. And we're people of the resurrection. And we believe that that's where our life hangs on because of what he has done for us. But we need to live like that intentionally with those around us. That the living God who wants to be our God this Christmas as we celebrate all that he offers us. Let us pray. Father, today, I know that as we face the Christmas season, for some of us, if we don't see it in the light of your having sent Jesus to be our guardian redeemer as our Messiah, it just seems like hopeless. But today, we just want to pray, like Ruth said to Naomi, we want to go where you go. We want to live with where you are. And I would ask that if there's anyone here this morning, Father, that they could just ask you that, Jesus. That you would say, Jesus, we want to go where you are. We want your people to be our people. Jesus, we want you to be our God. And that we know, Jesus, that the lost doesn't have to define who we are. Your response to the lost can define you, but we know, Jesus, that's not what you desire for us. And so we want to respond today by saying yes to who you are as we celebrate that great gift of life that you've given us through your sacrifice. God, thank you for being our great guardian redeemer. Thank you for this amazing story that goes so far back into the history of the Bible, that helps us prepare with hope for this Christmas season. And as we prepare to walk in the guardian redeemer of this world, Jesus, we just lift our prayers gratefully to you today. And we just ask it in the name of your